Hello and welcome to New Speak. I'm Peter Whittle. This is the New Culture Forum's look at the week's news. Before we do that, just want to say that this week we had our very first local NCF Locals event. It was in Southend-on-Sea in Essex. Great success. It was lovely. So thank you to the people who came along if you're watching now. Obviously we're going to be having more. I can tell you there's a date coming up in Manchester later this month, and indeed then after that in Norwich. So this is something we're keeping true to our word. We're going to be going around the country. So keep an eye out for those dates. Now, this week I think you'd agree that if you look at the mainstream media, the main story seems to have been the Brexit deal with Rishi Sunak, which of course I suppose is important. However, we tend to choose subjects here which are of greater concern to you, certainly, and to us. And two of the subjects today actually revolve around schools. Of course, there is this case of the Quran being scuffed, it seems accidentally, in a school in Yorkshire, and the consequences of that and what's happened as a result of that. And then also we've had extraordinary situation of kids being taught by a drag queen in the Isle of Man about the fact that there are 73 different genders. You might say this is now par for the course, but anyway, we're going to be talking about those today. Also, get your pronouns ready. I do know that you do have pronouns because we're going to be talking a bit about misgendering too. To start with, all joking apart, this situation we have, which is, I should add, 10 miles from Batley Grammar School, where in fact the teacher is actually still in hiding, I might add, for having given his pupils pictures of the Muhammad, the Islamic prophet. Can you just tell us exactly what happened in this case, actually, Rafe, with the Quran apparently being damaged and the outcome?
Sure. Well, it's a disturbing but altogether unsurprising story, alas, today. What we had is a school in Wakefield. An autistic boy brought in a copy of the Quran for losing a computer game. As part of a day, he had to bring in from home a copy of the Quran, which he read out in the playground. As he was bringing it in with three other boys, there was a bit of a scuffle, and the book just fell on the ground, but by no one's fault. And in the process of falling to the ground, it got slightly scuffed. It got a little smudge on one of the pages. That was it. A harmless action. The school has admitted that there was no malicious intent here whatsoever. But the firestorm that has developed from this harmless story that should have been dealt with in school, the school reached out to the police, who said that they were looking into the matter, and they later charged this incident as a hate incident, even though there was no malice of intent. You then had community leaders being consulted, as is always the case with these sorts of stories. These unelected, unappointed community leaders, which community do they actually represent? Because the young Muslims of today really have no connection to these elder people. Things happen completely in tandem with this. You had this horrifying scene of a press conference held that was led by a Muslim counsellor who had said essentially that if this had been an adult who had committed this, there would be huge protests outside the school, but because it was a child, they weren't going to have huge protests.
That's nice of them.
And then it turned out that there had been death threats by other school children against this young autistic boy, and next to them all was the poor mother of this boy, who looked like she was a hostage in an ISIS video, being forced to deliver a message saying, "I'm not going to prosecute because I don't want my child to be harmed." And you think, my gosh, we've got to this sort of state of affairs where the police turn a blind eye to death threats, and a harmless incident in the playground becomes a hate incident. And quite frankly, we don't live in an Islamic state. We don't have modern blasphemy laws here. And yet what we're having through these inactions by the police in terms of death threats and by this deliberate attempt to defend the indefensible, you've got blasphemy through the back door.
Yeah.
And you just have to think, a lot of these people, this is only, as you said, 10 miles from Batley. It's 30 minutes down the road from Rotherham, where we have, of course, the infamous rape gang scandals. A large population here is of Pakistani origin, and of course we know what happens in Pakistan with blasphemy laws. You get people being stoned in the street, being burnt alive over this, and you just have to think, how long is it going to be before you get a far more dangerous and scary result?
Yeah, I mean, what else can I say after that? I mean, that really does sum it up, doesn't it? I think there's always this threat of violence, isn't there? That's how these things work. You know, the community leaders come with this hyperbole, this incredibly inflated language. And we just see the headmaster, the school, the police, and the poor parents just capitulating because they're terrified. Now, I remember one of the first times I came on this show, last year, remember the story about the cinema manager who was showing it was a similar kind of thing, wasn't it? It was a film, and because people didn't like it, then mob rule kind of takes over. So what we've got essentially is what Rafe's just said, isn't it? It's blasphemy laws, it's Sharia by the back door.
The thing is, though, is that, you know, you sort of, for me, the most appalling thing is to see this policeman sitting there.
Oh,
Yeah.
I don't know how senior he was actually, but it's in a way beside the point. You sort of think he was actually condoning by his presence what was going on. I mean, isn't that appalling? I mean,
Well,
you know,
I mean, it's so bad. I find myself agreeing with Saka today.
What did she say?
Well, she said, I can't believe something's happened so immoral as a 14-year-old autistic boy who's been threatened with death threats, being suspended from shamed and suspended from school, and that's precisely what's happened, doesn't it? This is a public shaming, essentially, when this little boy who has disabilities has done nothing wrong. The policeman was saying, "Oh, this is a sad day. This is a sad
didn't
day."
they record it as a hate incident?
that's right. But I'm glad that Saka has said this, because you know the left are notorious for their
We
silence.
should say Saka, she's very much she's a radical leftist communist for Novara Media. She works for Novara Media.
Yeah.
And the left are notoriously silent when it comes to the misogyny and the racial hatred you get from Islam, whereas they're the first ones to burn an effigy of the Pope over issues like abortion or over condom use in Africa and so forth, or the lack of female priests in the Catholic Church. So it's good to see this happening. But this is an institutional failure on all levels. We saw this again in Rotherham with the rape gangs there. The lessons have not been learned. And I don't see, if we're still at this position now, that the lessons ever will be learned. There is no hope, I think, to have any faith that the police will actually do their duty and treat Islam as if it were Christianity. Because, my gosh, you can go into any gallery in Shoreditch, I'm sure, and find some anti-Christian artwork there, Bibles being used in some sacrilegious way or being desecrated. You know, I should have the right to tear up pages of the Quran and make a papier-mâché portrait of Muhammad. But I know that if I did that, I probably would be charged with a hate incident.
Yes.
And that is outrageous in the land of free expression.
But just compare this, compare the actuality of this to the rhetoric around the far right scare. Okay, that I think that is a really good comparison, because you see the institutions, the police, kowtowing to this intimidation, whereas you've got a few people, you know, rightfully worried about what is potentially happening to their 15-year-old daughters when you've got a hotel full of asylum seekers there and we don't know who they are or where they're from, you know. And I think the comparison there is really well worth making, because one is real and it's being treated as though it isn't, and the other one is complete fantasy and it's being treated as though it's real.
You know, you say about institutional failure as well. I mean, the thing is, what always strikes me about these occasions, it's like I'm like a broken record, I'm afraid, is no chance of any senior political figure commenting. Apparently, is it right that the Home Secretary said something about this?
She said that she was concerned about all of this. But you would expect, if somebody like Suella Braverman, who's made her cut her cloth by being hard line, can come out with something so measly mouthed as that, rather than being definitive on this point and saying we have no place for this in our culture. Everyone has the right to criticize any religion. And you know, just as the school said that the book wasn't treated with the respect it deserves. well, who decides how much respect this book deserves? You know, the humanists have come out and said this is outrageous. I don't have any obligation to respect any book whatsoever.
But there's something else here, isn't there, as well? And it's about the news agendas. So it's a mainstream news thing. They just don't really touch it, or they don't touch it.
Have
in a
they not
meaningful
touched
way.
it at all? Really?
Well, they might have touched it, but they haven't. They haven't touched it in a way that is, you know, rightfully outraged, and the people are just talking about this on social media. It isn't getting the attention it deserves and the comment it deserves. Perhaps it's just being presented. I think it was presented in something like the Wakefield Chronicle or something like that, and that's where it's gone viral. But I think in the mainstream media it's been touched upon, but
and nothing's going to happen. You know, when that film that you referred to was pulled, I said at the time, every cinema should screen that film just to make the stand. The only way you can oppose these people is with an aggressive assertion of our Western cultural values.
Well, the reason I mentioned that was, I think the first time, it was one of the first times I came on as a regular on this show, so that the story really sticks in my mind. And we talked about that risible, pathetic figure who was just like a rabbit in headlights.
Oh, he was a cinema manager.
Who was the cinema manager.
Yes, yeah.
But when you look at this story, that's the police. That's the police.
You know? But you have to also remember, you know, I've given up on this sort of issue at the moment, because when you had the Charlie Hebdo incident in 2015, we had this mass shooting in France of the cartoon headquarters that published a cover or image featuring Muhammad, and you had at that time, I think, a wonderful response by other media, where lots of media actually reprinted the image of Muhammad in their newspapers and magazines. Not everyone; some actually are damned by not doing it, but many of them did do it. That should have been the crunch point. That should have been the epiphany for everybody in the West as to how you should respond to these things. If that sort of a tragedy didn't spur the Western world into decisively tackling this issue, I don't think anything actually can. No. And I don't think we're ever going to find a way to get ourselves out of this. We need to actually have some way of aggressively asserting our values and letting them know that we will not stand down. Because the more you tolerate this, you create precedent after precedent after precedent, whereby it becomes accepted by them that we will always yield to them.
But we will never do that because of the broader context of how our values are under attack in every single instance. And the other stories we're going to cover today will illustrate that point, won't it? There's no way that we can stand up for and push back against religious intolerance when we can't even define what a woman is.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't really know. You know, when you say aggressively assert, I know what you mean by that, but you know, it does worry me. What would it take? I mean, I remember, I know this isn't terrorism, and it's not. No one's saying it's terrorism, but you know, when people stood in Manchester and sang "Don't Look Back in Anger" after the Ariana Grande thing, I remember thinking, they've just slaughtered your daughters.
Yeah.
You know what? What is it going to take for you? Don't know. You should be angry.
You should be angry. Of course, you should. You know this ridiculously.
Well, solution is difficult here, and it's getting worse year by year. As a number of migrants coming into this country come from Islamic states. Now, I wrote an essay on this larger subject in this book, Fighting Back, that we just printed, where I was amazed to discover that British Muslims are far more likely than French or German Muslims to identify as Muslim first and British second. And we have a far larger percentage of British Muslims who sympathise with ISIS and fundamentalism. So they're not just terrorists, but they're the sympathisers, almost twice the rate. They're still a minority, but I think it's at 15%. 15% of the numbers who are over here. We're talking about 150,000 people who sympathise with all this. This is only going to get worse. And yes, you ask, how do you respond to this? Well, one way is through the education system to actually teach the values of freedom of speech and expression. But even there, again, Denmark has the best solution to this, but Denmark has has a better chance. They ensure that no more than 40% of pupils in any school are of a minority ethnicity. So the majority are always white Danes. And I don't know how we can get to that situation in these areas, which are so heavily Islamic, but that seems to be the only way to do it, is to make them a minority in a larger white culture in order to assert the supremacy of Western values.
Well, in other words, you mean integrate, presumably.
Yeah.
Integrate. I mean, you know, because there's not, in the name of multiculturalism, actually you've got lots of areas which are monocultural. Right? So you mean basically what they've done in Denmark is actually forced integration, isn't it?
Exactly, and they've torn down ghettos in order to ensure that, and they've kicked out people who have criminal records. They can't get social housing.
But in order to do that, you have to be very clear about what your value system is, and we don't have a British value system. That's the problem. We've got a value system that absolutely and totally kowtows to the intolerance that they're demonstrating.
All of this under a conservative regime.
And all of this under a conservative regime.
I think actually that should be some kind of motto at the end of every show we do. And all of this. Wouldn't it be great if we had a Tory government of 80 majority? Wouldn't it be great? With this, just one more point on this. Harry Miller, if you remember, was the man who sort of managed to get the police to change their guidelines on what's called non-crime hate incidents. This was supposedly a hate incident in the school. He said that actually they've gone back to square one. It was a Pyrrhic victory, really, because they've gone back to square. They are now treating these things as crime, which is a great worry. In other words, people say, what is a non-crime hate incident and how dare you be, reporting them and keeping stats on them and all the rest. And she said, well, we've got around it by actually treating it as a crime. I don't quite know how that works.
No, but again, it's part of the broader context that illustrates how the whole thing works. I mean, I know so many people, women, who have been untoward about paedophiles, and they are, they're getting visits from the police saying, don't say that, don't say, or God forbid if someone's misgendered somebody, you will get the plod round straight away. So it's all of these things that a few years ago we wouldn't have even recognised as things, let alone crimes, are leading the agenda. Whereas the police dealing with things like house break-ins, muggings, rape, murder, and all of those things come way, way down the list.
Well, on this. Shockingly weak school authorities here. In the Isle of Man this week, actually not maybe the school, but the local council or the Isle of Man government, wanted a review, an inquiry into something that had been happening in that school, Philip. I mean, if you can just tell us this involves drag queens, doesn't it, and what kids are being taught? This
involves drag queens, but the overall educational culture in this school, which seems to be completely and utterly sex obsessed. Okay, so I'll give some details in a minute, but what happened was essentially the children were alarmed, and they spoke to the teachers, who did nothing. So the children had to take responsibility and speak to their parents. And it was the parents who actually sounded the alarm and said, these things are crazy. And I'll just read out. Did. Yeah, right, I'll just read out some of the things that have been happening. This is Queen Elizabeth School in Peel on the Isle of Man. Have reported that Year 7 pupils were taught by a drag queen who told them there are 73 genders. Okay. When one upset child responded and said, there's only 2, the drag queen allegedly responded and said, you've upset me, and made the pupil leave the class. Some 11-year-olds at the school were taught about oral and anal sex, while another group learned about sex change operations and were shown how skin graft taken from a girl's arm could be used as an artificial penis, according to reports. And that's from the Telegraph earlier this week.
But the thing is about the Isle of Man, had a reputation for being pretty hard and fast. I mean, and being conservative. I mean, to the point where they were always a bit of a bête noire, weren't they, for progressives?
And that's one of the reasons why the great author George MacDonald Fraser, who wrote the Flashman novels, who viewers might be familiar with, actually moved to the Isle of Man because it was a bit of an oasis. And yet we have this. So the question is, if it's like that in the Isle of Man, my God, what's it like in the rest of the country? Do
you think? Oh God, I can't bear almost to say the expression, the tide is turning. But do you think that the greater awareness of this whole agenda, the sexual agenda, is making people finally wake up? I mean, parents wake up about school.
Well, Miriam Kate, the Tory MP, has said, she's very happy to see the government of the Isle of Man do this review. But her great concern is, here in England and Wales, we don't actually know what's going on in our schools. Parents, and we had, didn't we? We had Calvin Robinson did a Heritage episodes where one lady says she tried her best to actually access materials that her school was teaching her children, and she was denied access because of copyright and so forth. All these sort of veiled attempts to just gloss over the whole issue. This was the problem. But you know, it's so outrageous, this story, that you have a drag queen teaching 73 genders, telling one child to leave the room because that child said there are only two genders or two sexes. Let's stop using gender. There are only two sexes. And he said, "Oh, you've hurt me, leave the room." Can you imagine doing that to a young child? And you think, what sort of crazy world can see this as being in any way acceptable? Who are these teachers? And then I sort of thought, well, actually, they live in this leftist echo chamber where everything becomes normalized and they become desensitized to the real shock value. It's like somebody who watches extreme horror or extreme porn. The first time you watch it, you're shocked. But if you spend years watching this extreme stuff, it becomes normalized to you. And I think they don't actually realize what they're doing, and they're adults, and the impact that has on a child's mind is even worse. And I've said for years on this channel and elsewhere, forget schools, it's the teacher training colleges that are essentially the equivalent of the Islamic madrasa. These are the woke madrasas, teacher training. They're churning out. We have fewer than 10% of teachers who vote for right-wing parties in this country. A huge change from when we were at school. When you're in that echo chamber, suddenly all of these radical ideas are completely normal.
Well, I'm in the echo chamber. You know, I work in a university and I work just like literally down the road from Wakefield, actually. I work in Leeds. So I know what it's like. But I've also, I said a few weeks ago, didn't I? That I was in a school a few weeks ago, and it's literally like going to a Soviet indoctrination camp. There were murals on the wall. There was a BLM mural. There was an NHS mural, and you really do feel like you're going into this other world. And if you challenge any of these ideas, that it's not only you're wrong, it's you're wicked, you're evil, and there's real shock. Because children have just been so indoctrinated, and it's the indoctrination that's the really terrifying thing.
I mean, last week we had on the channel just a wonderful couple, Tom and Haley Bowen, who've just started their own school.
So what you're saying is,
and I mean, you know, it's basically a classical Christian education, which basically is going to prove, I think, very, very popular. But is this the way forward then? I mean, basically, we just need people to start their own schools. I mean, isn't that the way? Is that the only way? I can't see. It's too big, isn't it?
Well, we've championed for a long time this whole concept of building our own institutions, and nothing is more important actually than building our own schools and our own universities. And I've long championed the idea of the American private colleges, Hillsdale, Claremont, these places that teach a classical civilized education. And now you have this wonderful couple doing that on the primary school level. But that's what we need to do. It's only by creating our own institutions that we will be able to actually try to reverse the tide somewhat. Although people will be forgiven for feeling like King Canute on many of these issues.
Yes. I think basically, on the back of that, they've had some donations. I hope they've had more since. And in fact, one job application from someone who wants to work with them. I mean, I'm not being frivolous here. I think what they're doing is fantastic. But I'd agree with you. I think it's the only way actually forward. I spoke to Matthew Goodwin recently for an interview that's coming up. And he was very, very, very sort of doubtful about the future of universities, for example. Very much along the same sort of lines.
Well, I'm really doubtful about the future of arts, humanities, and social sciences because they seem to be captured. You know, they are captured, aren't they? You know, and if we're talking about 73 genders, it's not dissimilar to 72 virgins in heaven, is it? It's a similar kind of concept, and what we've got is a cultish obsession with a gendered soul that seems to orientate thinking. And that's not thinking. If you're thinking about 73 genders, or 100 genders, or whatever it is, then it's just gobbledygook.
And of course, the sad thing here is, yes, we can create our own institutions in terms of schools, in terms of universities, but not museums and galleries. No. When you think of our greatest national assets, those are lost to us, you know.
But also the tragedy of that, of having to create institutions outside of the mainstream, And the responsibility of having to homeschool, for example, and the amount of skill and time and energy that takes to do that properly. You know, it's putting the onus on people in a way that should never, ever be there.
When it comes to, you mentioned museums and things, institutions, you know, the complete capture of these places. I think, as you said, Philip, there's one way of knowing if they've been captured. They use this term values all the time. If they start using the word values, then you know it's been captured. What have you actually given up or don't do anymore as a result of what's gone on in the past, say, like 10 years? I mean, I say 10 years, that's maybe quite a long time. But I mean, I know there are certain things, I find it hard. I was a great movie fan. Loved, in fact, I was a film critic for 20 years. Now, rarely. Because I don't want to see what I think is going to make me angry. What do you not listen to?
Well, it's much the same. So when I listen to the BBC, as I said before, it's always Radio 4 Extra, which is the archival material. I love listening to the old stuff, but I loved going to the theatre, and now I refuse to go. You know, they just recently had this thing called Best of Enemies, which was about Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley Jr. Two great men. I respect them both very greatly. A friend of mine was a friend of Gore Vidal. They had a black chap playing William F. Buckley Jr. Now, he was actually quite controversial during the civil rights movement. I thought, how can you possibly have a black chap playing this chap? And then again, you got David Copperfield with this Dev Patel playing the lead actor. And it's a shame. I want to watch these things. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Again, Dev Patel playing there. I just can't bring myself to watch something which is so historically inaccurate. It is a great shame. But it's interesting to note, actually, it's public subsidy. If you go to the theatre, you don't get this wokeness so much in the West End. It's the National Theatre and these places. Yeah. And it seems as if if government funding were taken away and they had to become commercially reliant, I think the fact that people vote with their feet where they're going to go, I think that might make it a deciding factor.
Do you think, I mean, is there, what do you not read anymore?
I was going to say it's novels essentially. I don't read.
Well, like modern novels.
Yeah, I don't read modern novels. So I only read old stuff because you just can't read modern novels. Even if you're reading gender, there's a Freudian slip, isn't there? Even if you're reading genre stuff, it always comes back to the same thing. It's sexuality, it's gender, it's race, all of those things relentlessly drilled into you as you read it. So I stopped doing that about 8 or 9 years ago.
It's funny because there's a show that I've been watching on Netflix, which started in 2005, finished 2020, and I loved the first 8 years of the show I've been watching, and it's great.
What is it?
It's called Supernatural. And I just enjoyed watching every episode. And then suddenly, around sort of 2011 or so, more women are there. And suddenly these tiny women can beat up these big brutes. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That never used to happen before. And then you get suddenly everybody has to be a black woman if you're going to be a protagonist, and the antagonist has to be the white male. And you can just sort of chart the history of the woke movement through this one television show, where I think someone could probably do a PhD thesis on.
But that's part of the narrative, which is another narrative we've been talking about, which is the representation and proportion of different kinds of people on television and in adverts and all the rest of it. So there's just been some research come out where 45% of people now are kind of quite alarmed at how it's completely, is it television or adverts are completely unrepresentative of real life.
Disproportionate.
Yeah. And it's only 45. I think William Clouson of the SDP said, well, what about the other 55%? Are they blind?
A lot of those people, the other 55%, probably do mind, but they are going along with what they think they should.
Well, the funny thing here is that Lloyds Bank actually did the research report into this in 2016 and then 2018, and they found in 2016 that 19% of minorities, of people in ads were minorities, and they said this doesn't go far enough. At that time, fewer than 18% of the country was ethnic minority. Yeah. So here you've got more, 19%. Yeah. By 2018, it was 25% of people in ads were ethnic minorities, far ahead of the 18% that we now know it actually is. But that's not enough. And I thought, well, what is enough for you guys? Well, post George Floyd, we now know that the vast majority of people on ads are actually, and they were actually saying 60%, we still have 60% of people being white in ads, as if that was somehow a negative.
Yeah.
Yes, no, it is apparently people are far more concerned in this country than any other. I think it was a Europe-wide survey, and with pretty good reason actually, because I mean you do really feel actually sometimes when you watch it as actually, wait a minute, is this actually this country? Because it's entirely, isn't it, 90%?
Part of it for me is we're just completely removed from reality. Once you start with these quotas of representation, and it's never enough. It's never enough, and it's never enough. You're presenting. This is one of the reasons why I don't bother with fiction. Fiction's fiction, but it should speak reality back to you in some kind of way. And none of it does. It speaks a particular code. It's fiction that speaks another kind of fiction back to you, and you're asked to believe it.
Yes.
It's social engineering.
It's social engineering.
It's infuriating. I find even just sort of like magazines. I used to read Vanity Fair, for example. It's an American. Used to like it. Read it. The New Yorker. These things. These kind of. It's not so much on these issues. It's more like this splenetic hatred of Trump. That killed it for me. I thought everything is going to be suffused with this.
So there's also the fact that we now know the political views of people we never should know about.
Exactly.
Our comedians. So I used to like watching Alan Partridge. I can't watch it now because I know how vitriolic Steve Coogan is on issues like Brexit and so forth. And I don't want to watch what you watch because I know that you loathe me and what I stand for, my views. So why am I going to watch your program? And suddenly you've cut off the few things that are funny today. I no longer can watch.
That's the important point. Even if he had a very strong attitude towards Brexit, or say, okay, you can kind of live with it, but it's always along with an insult. It's always an implied insult. These ghastly people, it's quite
it's
right.
a new snobbery, right? It's condescending elitism.
Oh, totally. But and that threads right through the institutions. That threads through all of the policy, as I was saying the other week, and all of the education, and it's people like us. How can we buy into it? How can we watch it? How can we read it when it's every single message within it is geared to hate us, basically?
Well, I mean,
on that note,
yes, no. I was going to suggest. You mentioned that unreality and unreality. While we're in the kind of zone of unreality, Sam Smith, the singer, right, he's what he calls himself non-binary. So therefore, he's like they and them and all the rest of it. This wonderful piece he done on Breakfast TV recently. He was talking about the fact that he liked fishing or something. There's this, and he said he talked about fisher them, and he kept on referring to fisher them. I like watching the fisher them, not fishermen. And of course they let it all go, right? I mean,
someone said, does he do any gigs in Themchester?
Exactly.
Probably not bearing in mind what Noel Gallagher's just said about it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Because you've had that. And this sort of basically, this wonderful, we're going to show a clip actually for a bit of light relief. Poor guy in it. This happened in Newham Council this week, where a councillor sort of stepped into this minefield of misgendering. So let's just take a look at this.
We should probably set it up and say that this was a leader of the Green Party in Newham Council who was supposed to be opposing the budget and stormed out because dealing with the finances of the borough wasn't important. The important thing was he
was misgendered.
She had been misgendered.
Okay, well, here we go.
And stormed out, and this poor, bewildered council chair had to do this apology.
I've been informed that I misrepresenting the councillors' name. I should have said them rather than he. So I do apologise for that. And I think that's what's affected him, is it? Them. That's yes. So my apologies to him for misquoting. Okay, for them. Sorry.
Your heart goes out to him, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Really?
I mean, it's just it's so. It reminds me of Faulty Towers and Don't Mention the War. I mentioned it once, but I think I got away with it, or not, as this case may be. But if you just think about the broader picture there about Newham, all right, so I think it's something like, this was 2021, it's probably not going to be that much different now. 25% of people earn below the living wage. 50% of children are living in poverty. And this joker's worried about being called them.
And it's the pure culture clash we have here, because Newham has the second largest Islamic population in the country, along with next to Tower Hamlets next door. And I looked at the council list for Newham, and it's a huge. I couldn't believe how many councillors they have, but the majority of them were ethnic minority, primarily Muslim. And I just thought, this is when you get the two worlds: trans lobby meets the Islamic lobby.
But there's a particular etiquette here, isn't there? Where they smell blood. Okay, and they know, and this poor guy, I think, as we've just seen, is floundering, and oh God, sorry him, them, and they smell blood, and they wind up, and they flounce out, and it's just and that happens with all of these things.
But it's all performative.
It's all performative. That's the whole point. It's self-righteous indignation. How dare I'm so important, and my pronouns are so important. How dare you say this?
Well, it's a bit like the drag queen that you mentioned on the Isle of Man. She's not really upset. I'm upset. You should go out of the class. No. It's just all of it is without a jot of sincerity to it, I think. But have you ever been asked for your pronouns?
I'm in a position at the moment where I think I'm about to be.
Really?
Yeah, and
what
it's
would you do for it?
I'm not going to do it because I don't have to. So
you actually don't have.
I don't have to. No one has to. No one has to pronounce. Offer their pronouns. But if there's a situation, which there might be at some stage soon, where people ask me to, I have been asked actually to give pronouns at the bottom of email signatures.
I'm pleased to come out and say that I'm binary. My pronouns are 101010. That's a computer binary code joke for those who may not have got it.
Oh, that went over my head, I have to say.
No, but that's happening in so many workplaces, and it's only people who work for themselves or work in places like this, I suppose, that it's not coming for you. But Douglas Murray always used to say this, didn't he? If you don't think this stuff is coming for you, well, it really is.
But how often do you actually use these pronouns? I don't see any situation in which we're sitting here. I would never say he. I always taught, who's she? The cat's mother, right? I would say Philip over here, or you or Philip, and it's very rare that I think you get into a situation where someone is in earshot of you referring to them
because
as he.
It's in a corporate situation where you're sort of like dealing with emails and everything like that. You're going to have to keep saying they, them, or she, or whatever it is.
But there was a lovely situation I witnessed a few years ago. A couple of people, I won't tell you what context it was. But people were just making coffee and they were talking about something they'd been to see, and this woman misgendered the performer, and the other person said it's they actually. I said okay, and did the same thing as this counsellor, and misgendered about 3 or 4 times, and the other people watching. It makes the room so incredibly uncomfortable. Right.
Isn't it meant to, really?
And it's meant to, but the point is, they're talking about someone who isn't there. This is why it's so insidious and it's so ideological. You have to kind of police someone's thought, even though the person isn't there.
I think the basis of a lot of this is just very, very ordinary, tedious people wanting to be more interesting. We used to call it sexual tourism. Basically, it was like, I'm a little bit lesbian and things like that. Basically now it's non-binary. It's like they're boring. There's nothing else. So basically, what can they do? They can do this kind of stuff.
We're old enough to remember the traditional transsexuals. I think of someone like Jan Morris. Remember Jan Morris? Originally James Morris.
Conundrum, who wrote the amazing book Conundrum.
Wonderful writer, great travel writer, excellent historian, did a wonderful history of the British Empire. Now, those traditional transsexuals, of which there are many today, are aghast at these trans extremists that we see today. So if there's someone like that, and I have my father's distant cousin for 40 years has lived as a transsexual person, I'm happy to call such a person she, if that's actually the way that they live their lives, and they're living quietly. I'm entirely happy with that. It's when you get to this radical situation where there's an aggressive response, there's this demand that it be done, and now we're in a situation where, forget the 73 genders, the NHS has 100 genders, you know, and how can anyone be expected to know who is a Z and a Z, who's the Oompa and the Loompa, you know, and who's the Tweedledum and Tweedledee, you know? I mean, it's complete nonsense.
This is the point. That's sort of a good point you highlight there, actually. You know, I remember there were a couple when I was in UKIP. There were a couple of, you know, there was Frank Malloy. Do you remember Frank? Frank Malloy,
the boxer,
boxing promoter. You know, suddenly became, you know, a woman, and essentially, but one, you know, kind of showed a certain respect, madam this, madam that, you know, and everything. But the thing is that when it becomes aggressive like this, it makes your own attitude harden, doesn't it?
But that's the problem, and that's
I'm less likely now.
But that's what you're seeing even with the gay community. That's why you have the LGBT Alliance, because they are so worried about the reaction people are going to have towards normal gay people when they see what the LGBTQ plus IA lobby does with all of these.
It's the difference between seeing someone and being polite and going along because you feel as though you want to, or there's no problem with it. But when they start demanding that you not only think that way, but believe that fantasy is reality,
exactly,
that's the key thing.
The problem is this: the giveaway is this, because they can't legally enforce it. It's no one saying that. The problem is if you didn't have your pronouns, that's one thing. But then other people who've done it will say,
it's pressure. It's pressure.
No, why didn't you give your pronouns?
Yeah.
Or, so you don't have pronouns? You know, just say, well, no, I don't, because I would have put them if I did, you know? But in fact, it's a bit like they say, how can you tell a vegetarian? Because they'll tell you. Right, it's the same sort of thing, I think. But anyway, vegetarian, don't get me on that. Look, thank you very, very much, Philip. Thanks, Rafe. Of course, I didn't introduce, our senior fellows of the NCF here. I completely forgot in my excitement. Anyway, we shall see you next time. Thanks very much. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.